Rachel had always been the kind of person who found amusement in the simplest things. Her friends often said she could turn even the most serious place into a stage for her small jokes, the kind that made people either laugh or shake their heads. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, she decided to visit the city's Grand Museum, one of those places filled with ancient objects, tall marble statues, and long hallways that made every step echo. She had passed by the museum many times before but never actually gone inside. Today, she felt curious, thinking it might be a nice change of scenery and maybe even a chance for some fun pictures for her social media. The moment she stepped inside, she was struck by the calm atmosphere. The museum was cool and silent, with soft lights shining on beautiful pieces of history. Families walked quietly. Couples moved slowly from one display to another, and a few school groups gathered around guides who spoke softly as they shared facts about the artifacts. To most visitors, the museum felt like a place for learning and reflection. To Rachel, however, it seemed like the perfect background for her playful personality. She started her tour in a large hall filled with statues carved from stone. Some were tall and serious-looking, holding shields or wearing long robes. Others were small, showing ordinary people from centuries ago. Rachel walked around, studying the expressions on the stone faces. At first, she simply admired them, how detailed they were, how old they must be. But then, her playful side began to wake up. She stood beside a tall statue of a man holding a scroll and noticed how stiff and serious the figure looked. Without thinking too hard, she matched its pose, tilting her head the same way and raising her hand as though she too held a scroll. She giggled quietly at her reflection in the glass around the display and then snapped a photo. It looked funny to her, and she felt proud of the idea. She tried it again with another statue, this one of a woman holding a bowl. Rachel pretended as if she was handing something to the statue, laughing at her own creativity. Other visitors glanced her way. Most simply smiled, thinking she was enjoying herself harmlessly. A couple of older visitors looked slightly puzzled, unsure if they should laugh or feel bothered. But Rachel did not notice any of that. She was fully caught up in her own fun, taking one picture after another, switching between silly expressions or dramatic poses. Each new statue inspired a new idea. For Rachel, it felt like the entire museum was her playground. In one corner of the hall stood a museum guard named Mark. Dressed neatly in his uniform, he observed the room with calm eyes. He had worked at the museum for many years and had seen all kinds of visitors, those who were excited, those who were quiet, those who asked many questions, and those who hurried through without even reading a single sign. He had also seen people who, like Rachel, became a bit too enthusiastic. He didn't dislike such visitors. In fact, he enjoyed seeing people take interest in the museum. But he also had a responsibility: to protect the artifacts, maintain peace, and make sure everyone respected the rules of the place. When Rachel first began her playful posing, Mark noticed her and felt mildly amused. He had seen people do similar things before: children trying to mimic the statues, adults pretending to hold invisible swords. Usually, it ended quickly and without trouble. But as he watched Rachel continue with growing energy and louder laughter, he felt a slight sense of concern rise within him. Not because she had harmed anything, but because her behavior was drawing attention and beginning to disrupt the calm environment the museum tried to maintain. He decided to observe a little longer before stepping in. But as Rachel moved to another section of the hall, her steps became more lively, and she nearly bumped into a velvet rope that marked the boundary between visitors and the exhibit area. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. He began making his way toward her slowly, not wanting to startle her. Rachel, still unaware of the attention she was drawing, continued her little comedy show. She found a statue of two figures standing side by side and decided it would be amusing to act as though she were part of the scene. She stepped close, too close, raising her arms to match the posture of one of the figures. She laughed again, clearly enjoying herself. She had almost forgotten she was in a place meant for quiet observation, not playful imitation. A group of tourists nearby paused, watching her with a mix of curiosity and confusion. A child whispered to his mother, asking if he was allowed to do the same. The mother gently shook her head and guided him away. Still, Rachel did not notice any of this. She was too busy reviewing her photos and thinking about which pose she should try next. Mark finally approached her, keeping his voice gentle and polite. He had learned over the years that kindness was usually the best way to manage such situations. He stopped at a respectful distance and waited for her to look up before speaking. Rachel, sensing someone near her, turned her head. When she saw Mark standing there, she straightened up quickly, half expecting him to ask her to move aside for another photo opportunity. Instead, he spoke calmly. "Excuse me, miss," he said with a warm but firm tone. "I'm glad you're enjoying the museum, but please be careful not to get too close to the displays. These items are very old and precious." Rachel blinked, thinking perhaps he was exaggerating. She smiled lightly and replied, "Oh, I'm just having a bit of fun. I promise I'm not touching anything." Mark nodded politely. "I understand. But even being too close can be risky. We try to keep a peaceful environment for all our visitors. I would appreciate it if you could keep a little more distance from the exhibits." She brushed off his concern with a small laugh, thinking he was being overly serious. Sure, she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I'll be careful." Mark gave a final nod and stepped back. He hoped she would take the reminder to heart. Still, something about her carefree response made him unsure. He walked to another part of the hall, but kept her within sight. Rachel watched him leave and shrugged. She wasn't trying to cause trouble, she told herself. She was just enjoying the visit in her own way. And besides, she thought the guard was taking things a bit too seriously. After all, she wasn't breaking anything or yelling or causing any real issue. To her, it was harmless entertainment. She turned back to her phone and opened her photo gallery, smiling at the poses she had captured. She imagined how funny they would look when she posted them later. She had a small group of followers who loved her playful content, and she felt excited thinking about their reactions. As she walked deeper into the museum, she glanced once more at the guard in the distance. He stood straight and attentive, watching the room. Rachel thought he looked almost like one of the statues, serious, still, and focused. That thought alone made her smile again. She whispered to herself, maybe he needs a little fun, before continuing her walk. She didn't know it yet. But this quiet moment, this small spark of humor she felt, would soon lead her into a situation she had not expected at all. And while she found everything amusing now, the day would eventually take a turn she had never imagined. For the moment, however, she continued exploring, unaware that her light-hearted attitude would soon meet something a little more serious. Something that would teach her an important lesson she didn't yet know she needed. Rachel continued her tour through the museum, her laughter still echoing in her mind. She had always loved the feeling of freedom, the sense that she could go anywhere, do anything, and somehow make it her own. She glanced around at the other visitors, some of them moving quietly, others chatting softly as they marveled at the art and history surrounding them. But Rachel wasn't like them. She didn't want to just observe. She wanted to be part of the scene, to make her own mark. She strolled past a display of ancient pottery, its surface decorated with intricate designs from a time long gone. The pottery was beautiful in its own right, a testament to the craftsmanship of people who had lived centuries ago. But Rachel wasn't focused on the pottery itself. She was looking for something more interesting, something she could engage with, something she could turn into a joke. That's when she saw a large, beautifully carved suit of armor standing proudly behind a display case. The armor was massive, and Rachel couldn't help but feel a bit awestruck by it. It was unlike anything she had ever seen in person. The metal gleamed under the soft lights, and the intricate designs on its surface seemed to tell stories of battles fought long ago. But to Rachel, all she saw was an opportunity for a funny picture. She walked over to the display, eyeing the armor closely. She had to admit, it was impressive, and it made her think for a moment about the people who had worn it and the battles they had fought. But then, her mischievous side took over. She stood beside the case, struck a strong, exaggerated pose, as if she too was wearing the armor. She flexed her arms dramatically, puffed out her chest, and stood as tall as she could, pretending to be a fierce warrior. Her smile widened as she snapped a few photos of herself in that ridiculous pose. Perfect, she muttered to herself, reviewing the pictures on her phone. This is going to get so many likes. Rachel laughed at her own joke. She didn't notice, but a few people walking by glanced at her, their expressions a mix of confusion and amusement. It wasn't unusual for visitors to take photos in the museum, but Rachel's antics were a little more playful than what was typical. As she checked the pictures again, she thought about how she would caption them. Something like, "Fighting battles in style," she thought. It seemed like the perfect thing to post on her feed. Just as she was about to strike another pose, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see the same guard, Officer Mark, who had spoken to her earlier. He wasn't looking at her directly, but she could tell he was aware of what was going on. She had seen him a few times during her tour. He seemed to move quietly through the museum, keeping an eye on everything. There was something about the way he carried himself that made Rachel feel like he was always watching, but in a way that was calm and controlled. Rachel couldn't help but grin as she saw him coming. She wondered if he was going to give her another warning, but she brushed the thought aside. She wasn't doing anything wrong, right? She was just having fun. Besides, she had been careful not to touch anything. There was no harm in pretending to be a knight in shining armor for a few moments. Mark approached her, his footsteps firm but not rushed. He stopped a few feet away, his posture straight and professional, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his expression. Rachel couldn't help but notice how different he seemed from the other people in the museum. While most visitors were lost in the art, chatting quietly or silently admiring the exhibits, Mark was always vigilant, watching over everything with a steady gaze. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I noticed you were getting very close to the display. I just wanted to remind you to be careful. The artifacts here are irreplaceable. Idea. Inspirational news ist. Also." Rachel blinked, surprised by the sudden interruption. She quickly straightened up from her playful pose, feeling a bit caught off guard. "Oh, I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said, smiling a little sheepishly. "I was just having a little fun with the armor." Mark nodded politely but didn't smile. "I understand," he said. "It's just that even a small bump or jolt could damage something. This suit of armor is very old, and it's part of our history. Please, be mindful of your actions." Rachel thought about it for a moment. She wasn't doing anything wrong, right? She wasn't touching the armor. She was just standing near it, pretending to be a knight for a few minutes. But as she looked into Mark's eyes, she saw that he wasn't joking. There was no hint of amusement in his expression, only seriousness. "Oh, I see what you mean," Rachel said, her tone more thoughtful now. "I didn't mean to get too close. I just thought it would be funny to pose next to it. I won't get any closer, I promise." Mark gave her a small nod, satisfied with her response. "Thank you for understanding," he said. "It's just a matter of making sure everyone has a chance to enjoy the museum without any accidents." Rachel stood there for a moment, feeling a bit embarrassed. She wasn't used to being scolded, at least. Not over something so small. She had been having fun, and she didn't think her playful attitude would cause any problems. But Mark was right. The armor was an important piece, and even though it seemed harmless to her, There was always the chance that someone could accidentally bump into it or do something that could damage it. She looked at the suit of armor again, now with a new sense of respect. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a part of history, a symbol of a time long past. Rachel hadn't thought of it that way before. She had been so focused on her own fun that she hadn't stopped to think about the significance of the things around her. Mark seemed to sense that she was processing what he had said. He gave her one last glance before he turned to walk away. "Enjoy the rest of your visit," he said, his voice friendly but still professional. As Mark walked off, Rachel stood there for a moment, reflecting on the conversation. She wasn't sure what had come over her. She had been so caught up in her own world, trying to make people laugh, that she hadn't thought about the importance of the museum and the things inside it. It wasn't just about her fun or her pictures. There were other people here too, people who came to learn, to appreciate, to understand the stories behind these artifacts. She sighed, a little embarrassed by how she had acted. She hadn't meant any harm, but now she understood that there was a balance between having fun and respecting the place you were in. She could still enjoy herself, but maybe she needed to do it in a way that didn't disturb the others or make the museum staff uncomfortable. Rachel glanced at her phone again, but this time, she didn't feel like posting her photos just yet. She decided to keep walking through the museum, slowly taking in the exhibits without trying to make a joke out of everything. There were so many interesting things to see, and maybe it was time for her to start looking at them through a different lens. As she wandered deeper into the museum, she began to appreciate the quiet beauty of the exhibits around her. The ancient paintings on the walls, the delicate jewelry displayed in glass cases, the old weapons that had once been used in battles, each piece told a story. For the first time that day, Rachel truly saw the museum for what it was. It wasn't just a backdrop for her jokes and photos. It was a place full of history and culture, a place where people came to learn, to remember, and to reflect. Rachel smiled to herself. Maybe she could still have fun, but it didn't have to be at the expense of the museum's atmosphere. She could find a way to enjoy the visit without causing a disturbance. After all, the museum was full of stories, and she realized now that she didn't need to be the center of attention to enjoy them. She could be part of the experience without taking over. As she continued her tour, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would respect the museum and the people around her. She would still have her fun, but she would do it in a way that fit the place. And maybe, just maybe, she would learn something new along the way. Rachel continued walking through the museum, her mind still processing the conversation she had just had with Officer Mark. She hadn't expected such a serious response to her playful antics. The reminder to be careful, to respect the artifacts, lingered in her thoughts. She hadn't meant to disrespect the museum, but now that she reflected on it, she understood why the staff took their jobs so seriously. Everything around her, the statues, the paintings, the displays, was a part of history. These were not just objects. They were pieces of stories. Stories that had lasted for centuries. Rachel walked slowly through the museum, noticing the details she had missed earlier. She passed by a display of ancient pottery, its surface worn smooth from centuries of history. The bright colors that once decorated the pottery had faded, but the designs still told stories of old cultures, of lives lived long ago. Rachel felt a momentary connection to those ancient people. She could almost imagine them crafting the pottery, carefully painting the designs, their hands shaping the clay. As she wandered deeper into the museum, she found herself in front of an exhibit showcasing old, hand-carved wooden masks. Some were delicate, with intricate designs, while others were rougher, showing signs of wear from years of use. Rachel was drawn to the masks, their eyes staring back at her, as if they were watching her every move. She couldn't help but wonder about the people who had worn them. Were they part of a ritual? Or were they used in some sort of performance? Each mask seemed to tell a different story, and Rachel felt a quiet respect for the craftsmanship that had gone into creating them. She took a moment to read the small placards next to each exhibit. She wasn't usually the type to stop and read the information, but today, something felt different. The words on the placards explained the history of each mask, where it had come from, and what it had been used for. Rachel found herself intrigued by the stories behind the objects. These weren't just things. They were windows into a past she had never known. A past that had shaped the world she lived in today. As Rachel continued her walk through the museum, she passed by a few more exhibits, each one sparking a new thought or idea. She felt like a different person now, someone who could appreciate the history around her, instead of just using it as a backdrop for her jokes. The museum wasn't just a place for fun photos. It was a place of learning, a place that invited visitors to pause and reflect on the past. She stopped in front of a large display case that held a collection of ancient weapons. There were swords, shields, and even a few helmets. Some of the weapons were rusty, their edges dull from years of neglect, but others still held an air of strength. Rachel found herself staring at a particularly ornate sword. Its hilt was decorated with intricate designs, and the blade, though aged, still seemed to hold the memory of battles long past. She couldn't help but imagine the people who had wielded it. What had their lives been like? What battles had they fought? Had they ever thought that their weapons would end up here, in a museum, for people to look at and admire? For the first time that day, Rachel felt a sense of awe. The museum wasn't just a place for artifacts. It was a place where history came alive, where people could connect with the past and gain a deeper understanding of the world. She found herself wishing she had paid more attention in her history classes, wishing she had taken the time to learn more about the cultures and civilizations that had shaped the world. She smiled to herself, thinking about how much she had learned in just the short time she had been in the museum. It was funny, she thought. She had come here expecting to take a few pictures, have some fun, and maybe make a joke or two. But now, she felt like she was on a journey of discovery, of understanding, and of respect. As she continued down the hall, Rachel passed a few more visitors, some of them stopping to take photos, others quietly admiring the exhibits. She noticed that many of them were focused on the artifacts in front of them, lost in the stories they told. It struck her then how much she had missed by rushing through the museum without taking the time to truly look and understand. She had been so focused on herself, on her own amusement, that she hadn't stopped to appreciate the history around her. It wasn't just the artifacts that had changed her perspective. It was the people who worked at the museum, the guards, the guides, the staff who had shown her a different way of seeing things. Officer Mark's words had been a reminder that the museum wasn't just a place for fun and games. It was a place of respect, a place where people came to learn and reflect. His quiet authority had helped her realize that sometimes the world wasn't just about her. It was about understanding the bigger picture and showing respect for the things that mattered. Rachel paused in front of a large painting that hung on the wall. It depicted a dramatic scene, a battle between two armies, with soldiers on horseback charging at each other, swords raised high. The colors were bold and vivid, and the details were so intricate that Rachel felt as if she could almost hear the clashing of swords and the cries of battle. The painting was beautiful, but it was also overwhelming in its intensity. The scene captured a moment in history, a moment that had shaped the lives of countless people. She stood there for a long while, lost in the painting. The longer she looked at it, the more she understood its power. It wasn't just a picture on the wall. It was a story, a moment frozen in time. Rachel felt a deep sense of respect for the artist who had created it, for the people who had lived through that battle, and for the history that had brought them to this point. It was then that Rachel realized something important. The museum wasn't just a place to look at things, it was a place to experience history, to feel connected to the past. She had spent so much time thinking about her own experiences, her own fun, that she hadn't stopped to consider the bigger picture. Now, Standing in front of the painting, she understood. The artifacts, the paintings, the statues, they weren't just objects. They were part of a larger story. A story that included all of humanity. Rachel smiled to herself. She had come to the museum for a bit of fun. But now, she realized that she had gained something far more valuable. She had gained a sense of perspective. A sense of respect for the history that had shaped the world. The jokes and photos didn't seem as important now. What mattered more was the experience of learning, of understanding, and of connecting with the past. She continued walking through the museum, her thoughts now calmer and more focused. She was no longer looking for ways to make jokes or snap funny photos. Instead, she was looking for meaning in the artifacts, in the stories they told. The museum had become a place of reflection, a place where she could connect with the past and understand the world in a deeper way. As Rachel walked, she realized that the museum had given her more than just a lesson in history. It had given her a lesson in respect for the past, respect for the people who had lived before her, and respect for the places that preserved their stories. She felt grateful for the experience, for the chance to slow down and truly see the world around her. The museum had shown her that sometimes, the most important thing wasn't to be the center of attention or to make others laugh. Sometimes, the most meaningful experiences came from simply being present, from listening, and from learning. Rachel smiled again, a sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't sure what the rest of the day would hold, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never look at a museum the same way again. I am again so soon. But as he came closer, she realized that this part of the museum might be one that required a little more attention. She had heard from some of the other visitors that this exhibit was a bit more sensitive. Perhaps it was why Mark had been keeping an eye on it. "Ah, you've found the ritual section," Mark said, his voice low and calm. "This is one of the most important parts of the museum. These artifacts come from cultures that practiced ancient ceremonies. They're incredibly valuable, both historically and culturally." Rachel nodded, taking in the information. "I can tell. It's pretty fascinating, but also a little creepy, don't you think?" She laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. Mark didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "I understand what you mean. Some people find it unsettling, but it's important to remember that these items are part of a rich history. They tell the stories of people who lived in a very different time. People who believed in something beyond what we know today. These masks, these tools, they weren't meant to scare us. They were meant to connect people to the spirit world, to the forces they believed controlled their lives." Rachel thought about his words. She had to admit, there was something powerful about the objects in the room. The masks weren't just strange relics. They were symbols of a belief system, a culture that had once thrived. She could feel the weight of their history, how much they had meant to the people who had used them. Mark continued, "It's easy to look at these items and think they're just old things, but each one holds a piece of a much larger story. Stories of life and death, of belief and tradition. They weren't just created for decoration. These masks and tools were a part of people's lives, and they helped shape the world we live in today." Rachel nodded slowly. She had never really thought about it that way before. To her, the museum had always been a place to look at things and take pictures. She had never stopped to think about the deeper meaning behind the objects. But now, as she stood in front of the ancient masks and tools, she felt a shift inside her. The items in front of her weren't just relics from the past, they were pieces of a story she was beginning to understand. Mark took a step back, giving Rachel space to take in the exhibit. He didn't rush her or urge her to move on. Instead, he allowed her the time she needed to connect with the artifacts. It was clear he cared deeply about the museum and its purpose. His job wasn't just to keep things in order. It was to help people understand the significance of what they were seeing. Rachel took a few more moments to study the artifacts. She lingered by the masks, carefully considering their expressions and the stories they might tell. She wondered what it would have been like to live in a time when people believed in such powerful forces. What kind of ceremonies had they performed? What kind of lives had they led? The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she didn't know, how much history had been lost to time. Finally, after a few minutes of quiet reflection, Rachel turned to Mark. "You're right," she said. "I've always seen things like this as just old stuff. But I can see now that there's so much more to it. These artifacts are part of something bigger, something that shaped the way people lived." End quote. Ring. Mark nodded, his face showing a hint of approval. Exactly. It's easy to forget that history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's about people. It's about understanding how they lived, what they believed in, and what they valued. These artifacts help us connect with those people, even though they lived hundreds or thousands of years ago. Rachel stood there for a moment, absorbing his words. It wasn't just about respecting the artifacts, it was about respecting the people who had created them. She had always thought of history as something distant, something to be learned in a classroom or through a textbook. But now, standing in this quiet, dimly lit room, she realized that history wasn't just something that had happened in the past. It was something alive, something that could connect her to people she had never met but whose lives and beliefs had shaped the world she lived in. Mark gave her one last nod before he began to walk away. "Take your time," he said. "There's a lot to learn here." Rachel watched him leave, her mind buzzing with new thoughts. She turned back to the display of masks, her eyes now seeing them in a different light. They weren't just strange faces staring back at her. They were the faces of history, the faces of people who had once believed that these masks could connect them to something greater than themselves. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a deep sense of respect for the past. She had come to the museum looking for fun. But now, she felt like she was walking through a living story. A story that had been told by generations of people who had come before her. She smiled to herself, grateful for the lesson she had learned that day. History wasn't something to be taken lightly. It was something to be cherished, something to be respected. And as she walked out of the exhibit, she knew that the museum had given her more than just a day of sightseeing. It had given her a new understanding of the world. As Rachel stepped out of the darkened ritual room, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The quiet atmosphere of the museum, the soft lighting, and the ancient artifacts around her had shifted something within her. She had come in expecting to have fun, to take a few pictures and crack some jokes. But now, she felt like she was leaving with something much more valuable. A deeper understanding of the past and the people who had lived long before her. The artifacts, the paintings, the statues, they were not just old things. They were windows into other lives, other times, and they all held stories worth learning. She walked slowly through the museum, taking her time to reflect on everything she had seen. Each room, each exhibit, seemed to hold its own lesson. From the playful statues she had mimicked earlier to the ancient masks that had once been used in sacred ceremonies, everything had taught her something new. It was as though the museum had quietly guided her from a place of humor and lightheartedness to one of reflection and respect. Rachel's footsteps echoed softly through the hallway, the museum now feeling more like a quiet, sacred space than the lighthearted, tourist-filled spot she had once thought of it as. She passed by the paintings she had looked at earlier, the ones that had captured dramatic historical moments, and noticed the little details she hadn't seen before. The brush strokes on the canvas seemed to tell the story of the artist's emotions. The expressions on the faces of the people in the paintings weren't just frozen moments in time, they were feelings, hopes, and struggles captured for future generations to witness. She paused in front of one painting, a large one that depicted a battle scene. In the background, soldiers on horseback were charging at each other, their faces twisted in determination and fear. The colors were dark, heavy with the weight of the moment. But as Rachel looked closer, she noticed something else. A tiny figure in the foreground, sitting alone on the ground. The person wasn't engaged in the battle at all. Instead, they were looking off to the side, their face turned towards something beyond the chaos. Rachel felt a strange pull in her chest as she stared at that figure. It was as though they were searching for peace in a world torn apart by violence. As she stood there, lost in the painting, she realized just how much she had missed by rushing through the museum earlier. She had been so focused on her own entertainment, her desire to have fun, that she hadn't taken the time to really see the stories these works were telling. Now, she could feel the weight of those stories, the sadness, the bravery, the triumphs, and losses. Each piece of art, each artifact, carried the emotions of the people who had created it. And now, those emotions were passing through Rachel. She pulled herself away from the painting, a soft smile on her face. It wasn't that she didn't enjoy fun anymore, or that she couldn't still have a sense of humor. But now, she understood that there was a time for jokes, and there was a time for reflection. The museum, with all its treasures, had taught her to appreciate both. As she continued walking through the exhibit halls, she found herself near a display of ancient scrolls. They were neatly rolled up, tucked behind glass cases, with delicate writing on their surface. The text was in an old language, one that Rachel couldn't read, but she could still sense the importance of the words. She imagined someone, centuries ago, carefully writing each word with a quill, pouring their knowledge and wisdom into the scrolls. These scrolls weren't just pieces of paper. They were a bridge to another world, another time. They were a way for people to communicate across centuries, to share ideas and lessons that had survived the passage of time. Rachel took a step closer to the case, drawn by the feeling of history that seemed to hang in the air. She stood there for a while, thinking about how much humanity had learned over the years, and how much of that knowledge was captured in the objects she had seen today. She thought about the things she had learned during her visit about the importance of respecting history, about how every object told a story, and about how much of the past was still alive in the world around her. But she also thought about herself. She realized that her perspective had changed. She had come into the museum that morning with a light heart, ready to make jokes and take funny pictures. But now, she felt different. She felt more connected to the world around her, more aware of the history that had shaped everything she saw. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was part of the story, too. She was a part of a larger narrative, one that stretched far beyond her own life, reaching back through time to the people who had created the artifacts and artworks she had admired. Rachel smiled again, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over her. She had come to the museum to have fun, but she was leaving with something far more valuable. A deeper understanding of the world, a sense of connection to the people who had lived before her, and a newfound respect for the history that surrounded her. As she made her way to the exit, Rachel passed by the guard station. Mark was standing there, his eyes scanning the room, making sure everything was in order. Rachel stopped for a moment, thinking about everything she had learned. She had come so close to leaving the museum earlier, still wrapped up in her own world of jokes and photos. But thanks to his calm words and his gentle reminder, she had stayed. And in doing so, she had discovered a new way of seeing the world. She walked up to Mark, who gave her a small, polite smile when he saw her. "Did you enjoy the rest of the museum?" he asked. His tone still professional, but with a hint of warmth. Rachel nodded. "I did," she said, her voice soft, but genuine. "I didn't expect to learn so much. It's amazing how much history is packed into these walls." Mark nodded in return. "It's always good to see someone connect with what's here. It's not just about looking at objects. It's about understanding the stories they hold." Rachel smiled again. "I get that now," she said. "It's funny, when I first came in, I didn't really think about all the history behind the things I was seeing. But now, I see that everything here has a story. And those stories, are what make the museum so special. Mark gave a small nod of approval. Exactly. I'm glad you enjoyed it. As Rachel stepped out into the bright daylight, she felt a sense of peace. The world outside the museum felt a little different now. It wasn't that the museum had changed her. It was that it had opened her eyes. The artifacts, the paintings, the statues. They weren't just things. They were stories. And Rachel had learned how to listen to them. She knew she would come back to the museum again, not just to see the artifacts, but to continue her journey of understanding. She knew that every visit would offer her something new to learn, something new to appreciate. And this time, she would be ready to listen. Rachel took a deep breath and walked away from the museum. Her mind full of new thoughts, and her heart full of new respect for the history that had shaped her world. The day had been far more than she had expected, and she couldn't wait to see what other lessons the world had in store for her.